Welcome back, guys, to another episode of Developing Games with Construct 2. Today I want to talk about using arrays, for loops, and a for each loop in Construct 2. So again, my name is James Quick. You can find me on Twitter at JamesQQuick. My blog is blogs.msdn.com/quickthoughts, and then my YouTube channel, I have a bit.ly link below as well, so you can find other videos. Please comment any questions, concerns, suggestions, any of the above. So I'm going to pop over to Construct 2, and I've actually got something here left from my previous demo, so I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to start by basically just creating an array. So an array here, double click, an array is under data and storage, and that's exactly what an array is in general. It's a way to store things. So if you think about if you have a shelf with several, or a bookcase with several shelves on it, just imagine that you could put one thing on each shelf. So in each of those buckets is a way to think about it. You can put one thing. So there's 1D, 2D, and 3-dimensional arrays depending on if you just have X coordinates, if you have X and Y, or if you have X, Y, and Z, just like you would see in a math class or something like that. So I'm going to call this a scores array. I'm going to save it. And notice in the properties that, again, like I said, we have the width, height, and depth. Since height and depth are both 1, that means we're looking at a 1D array. If the height had a value greater than 1, it would be 2D, and then if we had depth as well, that would be 3D. So the first thing I want to point out is debugging your project. So I'm going to go ahead and run a debug here and open it up. So with debugging, actually, we can ignore this table text for now. But with debugging, I can actually click on my array and see what I've got in there. So again, these are the different buckets that we have on the left here. The 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up through 9. And arrays are zero-based indexing, so that's why it starts at 0. So 0 through 9 gives you 10 items. And then these are the actual items that we have in there. So I can actually go in and change these manually if I want to while debugging. I don't really need to now, but just something good to know. So let's take a look back in Construct 2 about how we actually add things to our array. So I'm going to go in to the event sheet. I'm going to do a system on start of layout. And on the start of the layout, I want to go into our scores array, and I want to set at X. So set at X means we're looking at a 1D array. They're set at XY, set at XYZ. Those are for 2D and 3D arrays, respectively. So set at X, I want to set, let's just start at the 0 index, and I'm going to just kind of do scores. So let's say I have 50 here, and then I'm going to copy this several times, a couple times. I'm going to say at the first index, I want to have, let's say, 75. At the second index, I want to have 25, and these could be whatever I want them to be. These are all just kind of random. Actually, this will be third index. This will be 100, let's say. So if I go ahead and debug again, we should notice that if we select on our scores array, we see those different values that we just inputted. So 50, 75, 25, and 100. Basically as we expected. So instead of going through and doing this part 10 times, I'm going to actually delete most of these. I'm going to add a for loop as a sub-event to the onStart of layout so that we only have to write one line to input stuff to our array, and it just updates depending on the iteration that we're on in the for loop. So again, a for loop is just used to repeat a certain step a certain number of times. So let's take a look at what that looks like. If I go in and add a sub-event here, I can go to System and then For. So we'll do a for loop. And this name is basically just for readability as far as I can tell. I just kind of describe what I'm doing. So if we're doing high scores in this array, I want to iterate through each score, basically. And remember, our arrays are zero-based indexing. So with 10 items, we're going to start at 0 and end at 9. And I'm going to copy this down here and delete the previous one. So typically in programming, you initialize a variable like int I, and that'll be for your iteration, and it'll start at 0 and go to whatever you want it to go to. So they don't have a very good or direct way to track which iteration you're on in these for loops, as far as I can tell, and please comment below if you have a better solution. But I'm going to add a local variable here and we can just call it I, and it'll be a number. It'll start at 0, and so it'll correspond to the iteration here. And to make sure that it gets updated appropriately, I'm going to add 1 to I So I'm going to add the number 1 to the variable I each time we go through. So it'll go 0, 1, up through 9. So here, instead of setting the value at the number 3, I'm going to set it to my variable I. So we're going to iterate 0 through 9, and I'm going to set the value to, let's say, 10 times I. So we should see 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, and so on. So let's debug this again. And let's open up Internet Explorer. Let's click on our array, and now in our array data, you should again see 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. And those are our 10 elements in the array. So a good way, for loops are very useful for arrays because again, we would have had to input each of those things manually. So instead of doing 10 lines of code, we add one event and take it down to 10 actions. Or excuse me, 2 actions versus 10 actions. So let's take a look at what a 2D array would look like. So to make the array 2D, we can just change the size. So we'll just add to the height, we'll just add it to be 2. So we're going to have 10 as the width and 2 as the height. So what we're going to do here is basically have a name and a score for each of these things. So here we're setting at X. That's if we have a 1D array. We now have a 2D array. So let's go back a little bit and choose set at XY. And the first, so X value will still be represented by the variable I. And then for the 0th Y index, we're going to add a name. So let's add James for each of these. I'm going to copy and paste this. And for the second, or for the first Y index, that's going to be the score. So that's where we're going to do the I times 10. So what we should see in our array is James in each of these rows, and then also the corresponding score. So let's debug this one more time. And let's click on our scores array. So yeah, so we see James 0, James 10, and these, obviously these names will change depending on what user you're using. And then the scores would too. So just a useful way to iterate through to save yourself a little time. So in addition to, let me delete this object over here, so I'm going to use it in a second. In addition to the for, we can also use a for each. So I'm going to go back to my layout, and I think I've got a video on functions, but to use a function, we can add the function object. And once we add that object, we can go into add event, and we can choose function, and we can choose on function, and call this function edit array, basically. And in this function, I want to go in and add a sub event, and this is where we're going to use our for each to iterate through each of the elements and update it. So I want to go into my scores array, and let's compare, or actually let's go, where is it? For each element here, and we're doing the X and Y coordinates. So this is going to, like I said, iterate through each of the elements in our array, and with each iteration they will keep track of the X coordinate, the Y coordinate, and then the current value at that index. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to add another sub event here, and I'm going to actually compare. So system compare two values. I'm going to compare my scores array dot y, or cur y. I want to say if it equals 0, that's going to mean it's a name, because here above with the 0th index in y, we were putting a name. So I'm going to change this name, let's say just to John, something random. Or actually, sorry, we're still comparing here. So this scores array current y, if it equals 0, then I want to go into the scores array. So scores array, and then set at xy. And I'm going to set it so it's going to be scores array.cur x and scores array.cur y. So that's getting the current x and y indexes of the array, and we're going to set this to John. And we're going to also go into scores array, choose set at x, y, and again the same thing. So scores array dot cur x and scores array dot cur y. So at the same index here, and I need to correct this in a second, so I'll do that in a second. But for each score that we have, we want to take that score. So scores dot array or scores dot cur. Wow, one second. Cur value, and let's add 1 to it. And my mistake here is we want to only update the score when the cur y is 1. So again, for the y values, if it's 0, that's going to be a name. If it's 1, that's going to be a score. So let me make sure I get everything straight here. So when it's 0, that means it's a name. That means I'm going to change the name from James to John. When it's a 1, that means it's a score, so I'm going to add 1 to that score. Something kind of random. So let's debug this layout again. And hopefully, in our debug, we'll now see, oh, sorry, I forgot one thing. We have this function defined, but we actually need to call it. So on start of layout, I'm going to add a blank sub event, and then I'm going to go in and call this function that's called edit array. And now when we debug, we should see the scores array now has the number, John as the user, and then the same numbers we had before, just adding 1 to each one. So again, the 3 things that we talked about here, the basics with arrays, you can have a 1, 2, or 3D array, so X, Y, and Z coordinates basically. You can add things to the array by setting the value at X, Y, or X, Y, Z. You can iterate using a for loop. So anytime you need to repeat something X number of times, you can use a for loop. And then we use the function here to call the edit array. And in the edit array, we use the for each X, Y to iterate through all of the elements in our array. And for each element, they keep track of the current X value, the current Y value, and then the current value of that index. So I hope that all makes sense. These are very useful, powerful things here with arrays and the for each. So I hope you can take advantage of these and it was worthwhile. Again, please comment below or find me on Twitter at JamesQQuick.